The Revolutionary 504 sit-in, a reaction to government discrimination that led to federal reform for the disability rights community.
I can tell you that every time you raise issues of separate but equal, the outrage of disabled individuals across this country is going to continue. It is going to be ignited. We will no longer allow the government to oppress disabled individuals. We want the law enforced. We will accept no more discussion of segregation.
On April 5, 1977, more than 120 disability rights activists occupied the United States Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, or HEW building in San Francisco in reaction to Secretary of HEW Joseph Califano's refusal to ratify Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. These activists were demanding action. The law was already on the books, but they wanted it to be fully enacted, protecting them from discrimination in programs receiving federal funding. The protest lasted 26 days, only ending once regulations were signed. Section 504 was a revolutionary civil rights law, and the reaction to it being ignored was to hold a successful sit-in, which led to real reform, including enforcement of Section 504 and later the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA. In the decades before the Rehabilitation Act's creation, there were no legal protections ensuring equal educational or career opportunities for people with disabilities. Society often viewed them as weak, feeble-minded, or incapable of advocating for themselves. Starting in the late 1800s, these beliefs came out in the form of eugenics, the forced sterilization of people with disabilities, often without their full informed consent. In 1972, an exposé on a New York State hospital, Willowbrook, was released. Children with disabilities in this hospital were being abused. Geraldo Rivera, the creator of the exposé, said,
"It was horrible. There was one attendant for perhaps 50 severely and profoundly retarded children, lying on the floor naked and smeared with their own feces. They were making a pitiful sound, the kind of mournful wail that it's impossible for me to forget."
The kids were being fed so quickly and ended up dying from pneumonia in some cases. In reaction to these forms of discrimination, the disability rights movement became public in the late 1960s after years of fighting for change in treatment and policies. People with disabilities have been characterized by stigma, isolation, and dependency for a long time in the United States. Edward Roberts, who was refused admission to University of California, Berkeley due to inaccessibility, and Judy Heumann, who was denied a job despite her qualifications, are examples of the opportunities that were taken away because of closed-mindedness surrounding disability. Section 504 was modeled after previous civil rights legislation that protected other minority populations. Its inclusion in the 1973 Rehabilitation Act was revolutionary. President Richard Nixon passed the Rehabilitation Act, but he claimed that Section 504 was not enforceable due to expenses and refused to sign for 4 years. Disability rights activists decided to act when the new Secretary of HEW, Joseph Califano, took office. Califano created a task force to review the regulations without a representative of the disability community. Activists feared the regulations protecting their civil rights would be watered down, so they created an ultimatum. Either Section 504 would be signed unchanged, or they would call for Secretary Califano to resign before April 5th.
No otherwise qualified handicapped individual in the United States shall solely by reason of his handicap be excluded from the participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance.
That was a direct quote from Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. This was the first civil rights law created to benefit people with disabilities. When April 5th arrived, Joseph Califano refused to sign Section 504.
It doesn't do any good to put out a set of rules if nobody's going to follow them.
In reaction, over 120 activists took control of HEW offices, refusing to leave until their demands were met. The choice to hold a sit-in was revolutionary because it defied stereotypes that people with disabilities are weak or incapable of asserting themselves. At the beginning of the protest, Senator Joseph Califano said that regulations would be signed in May, ending the protests in some cities. However, in San Francisco, demonstrators showed resolve, continuing to protest until regulations were signed. Inside the HEW buildings, protesters relied on each other to carry on. Many demonstrators chose to forego medical equipment and personal aids for the entire 26 days. The FBI shut off phone lines and water. To communicate with people outside of the building, deaf protesters would sign through the windows. Mattresses arrived 2 weeks into the protest. Food was delivered by organizations like the Black Panther Party. Some demonstrators even started a hunger strike during the occupation, refusing to eat until their sign or resign ultimatum was met. Late into the protest, a delegation of 14 demonstrators went to Washington, D.C. to demand a meeting with Califano. They hoped to persuade him to sign the regulations, but he refused to address the issue whatsoever. To get around D.C., the International Association of Machinists rented out a box truck, which can transport about a dozen people in wheelchairs at a time. At this point, there was national news coverage, and Americans were watching their president sneak out the back door of a church to avoid protesters with disabilities. Eventually, due to pressure from the press, Secretary Joseph Califano relented and signed Section 504 regulations. It took 3 presidential administrations, 5 years, nationwide demonstrations, and the takeover of a federal building in San Francisco, but finally, Section 504 was passed into law and changed. Judy Heumann said, "Through the sit-in, we turned ourselves from being oppressed individuals into being empowered people. We demonstrated to the entire nation that disabled people could take control of our own lives and take leadership in the struggle for equality." The public birth of the disability rights movement. For the first time, disability really was looked at as an issue of civil rights rather than an issue of charity and rehabilitation at best, pity at worst, said Kitty Coe. After Section 504 was ratified, there was a large societal change in perspective. Before Section 504, the responsibility of being accessible never fell on the organization. It was always the fault of the person with the disability. But after being signed, any organization receiving federal funding was legally mandated to have accessible facilities. The victory for disability rights ushered in a new era in inclusivity. But some disability rights activists were tired of thanking organizations for basic human rights. The disability rights movement didn't stop after the 504 sit-in. Activists continued to fight for civil rights in every aspect of life, eventually leading to the Capitol crawl, in which 8-year-old Jennifer, who was diagnosed with cerebral palsy at a young age, scaled the 83 steps to the United States Capitol with American Disabled for Public Transit, or ADAPT, and said, "I'll take all night if I have to," which triggered the signing of the ADA in 1990. The ADA led to much reform for people with disabilities, including broad civil rights protections in employment, public services, public accommodations, and telecommunications. Although the changes brought over the past 2 decades are profound, we are still at the beginning of a long-term march. We're changing how society deals with and responds to disability, said Kitty Coe. While the triumphs of the disability rights movement have been major, there is still much to fight for. In 2024, the rules in Section 504 were updated, and thanks to the help of disability advocates writing to the government, the new regulations are stronger and include more examples of disability discrimination. However, this led to Texas v. Kennedy, previously Texas v. Becerra, a lawsuit in which Texas and 16 other states are suing the U.S. government and claiming that Section 504 is unconstitutional. Since then, the 17 states decided to drop the constitutional challenge on the entirety of Section 504, but they continue to test certain sections of the updated rules, including provisions for gender dysphoria. The case is currently stayed. If the states are successful in winning the lawsuit, civil rights for people with disabilities that have been instated for over 50 years will be lost. Almost 50 years after its ratification, Section 504 is at risk, and the legislation's survival will depend on a new generation of leadership.